Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, Episode 2. I settled in front of the cheerful fire to enjoy my smoking coffee and asked Mrs. Dean how long she had lived here. 18 years, sir. I came when the mistress was married, and after she died the master retained me for his housekeeper. I asked her why Heathcliff let Thrushcross Grange and preferred living in a situation and residence so much inferior. He's rich enough to live in a finer house than this, but he's very close-handed, and as soon as he heard of a good tenant he couldn't bear to miss the chance of getting a few hundreds more. He had a son, it seems. Yes, he had one. He is dead. And that young lady, Mrs. Heathcliff, is his widow? Where did she come from originally? Why, sir, she is my late master's daughter. Catherine Linton was her maiden name. I nursed her, poor thing. I did wish Mr. Heathcliff would remove here, and then we might have been together again. What? Catherine Linton? I exclaimed, astonished. But a minute's reflection convinced me it was not my ghostly Catherine. Then my predecessor's name was Linton? It was. And who is Hareton Earnshaw, who lives with Mr. Heathcliff? Are they relations? No. He is the late Mrs. Linton's nephew, her cousin, and her husband was her cousin also. Heathcliff married Mr. Linton's sister. I see the house at Wuthering Heights has Earnshaw carved over the front door. Are they an old family? Very old, sir, and Hareton is the last of them, as our Miss Cathy is of the Lintons. Have you been to Wuthering Heights? I should like to hear how she is. Mrs. Heathcliff? She looked very well and very handsome, yet I think not very happy. Oh dear, I don't wonder. And how did you like the master? A rough fellow, rather. Is not that his character? Rough as a saw-edge and hard as stone. He must have had some ups and downs in life to make him such a churl. Do you know anything of his history? I know all about it, except where he was born and who were his parents and how he got his money. Well, Mrs. Dean, tell me something of my neighbours. Before I came to live here, she commenced, I was almost always at Wuthering Heights, because my mother had nursed Mr. Hindley Earnshaw, Hareton's father, and I got used to playing with the children. I ran errands too and worked about the farm. One fine summer morning, Mr. Earnshaw, the old master, set out on a journey to Liverpool. He promised to bring back a fiddle for Hindley and a whip for Miss Cathy. She was hardly 6 years old, but she could ride any horse in the stable. Mrs. Earnshaw expected him on the third evening, and the children begged to be allowed to stay up. Just about 11 o'clock, in stepped the master. He threw himself into a chair, nearly dead with tiredness. He opened his greatcoat, which he held bundled up into his arms. See here, wife, you must take it as a gift of God, though it's as dark almost as if it came from the devil. We crowded round and saw a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough to walk and talk. It stared and repeated over and again some gibberish that nobody could understand. I was frightened, and Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out of doors. She asked how he could bring that gypsy into the house when they had their own bairns to feed. The master tried to explain, with a tale of his seeing it starving and homeless on the streets, not a soul knowing to whom it belonged, so he thought it better to take it home because he was determined he would not leave it as he found it. My mistress grumbled herself calm, and Mr. Earnshaw told me to wash it, give it clean things, and let it sleep with the children. Hindley and Cathy began searching their father's pockets for the presents he had promised. The boy was a boy of 14, but when he drew out what had been a fiddle, crushed to pieces in the greatcoat, he wept aloud. And Cathy, when she learned the master had lost her whip in attending to the boy, spat at the little thing. They entirely refused to have it in bed with them or even in their room. This was Heathcliff's first introduction to the family. Within a few days they had christened him Heathcliff. It was the name of a son who had died in childhood, and it has served him ever since, both for Christian and surname. Miss Cathy and he were now very thick, but Hindley hated him. He seemed a sullen, patient child, hardened to ill treatment. He would stand Hindley's blows without blinking or shedding a tear. Old Earnshaw was furious when he discovered his son persecuting the poor fatherless child, as he called him. He took to Heathcliff strangely, believing all he said and liking him far more than Cathy. From the very beginning he bred bad feeling in the house, and at Mrs. Earnshaw's death, which happened less than 2 years after, Hindley had learned to regard his father as an oppressor rather than a friend, and Heathcliff as a usurper of his parents' affections and his privileges, and he grew bitter with brooding over these injuries. Mr. Earnshaw began to fail and grew irritable if anyone attempted to impose upon his favourite. He seemed to believe that because he liked Heathcliff, all others hated him. Our curate advised that Hindley should be sent to college. I hoped heartily we should have peace now. We might have got on tolerably but for 2 people, Miss Cathy and Joseph, the servant. He was and is yet the most wearisome, self-righteous man that ever read a Bible. By his knack of pious discoursing, he made a great impression on Mr. Earnshaw, and the more feeble the master became, the more influence he gained. He encouraged him to regard Hindley as a reprobate, and he regularly grumbled out a string of tales against Heathcliff and Catherine, always minding to heap the heaviest blame on her. Certainly, from the hour she came downstairs till the hour she went to bed, she was in mischief. Her spirits were always high and her tongue always going, singing, laughing and plaguing everybody. She was much too fond of Heathcliff, and the greatest punishment for her was to be kept separate from him. Mr. Earnshaw died quietly in his chair one October evening. Mr. Hindley came home for the funeral and brought a wife with him. She had neither money nor name to recommend her, was rather thin and young, but her eyes sparkled bright as diamonds. Mounting the stairs made her breathe very quick, and she coughed troublesomely sometimes, but I knew nothing of what these symptoms portended. Hindley Earnshaw was altered considerably in the years of his absence. He spoke and dressed quite differently, and on the very day of his return he told Joseph and me we must thenceforth live in the back kitchen and leave the house for him. His wife's early affection for Catherine tired very soon, and when she grew peevish, Hindley became tyrannical. A few words from her, evincing a dislike to Heathcliff, were enough to rouse in him all his old hatred of the boy. He drove him from their company to the servants, deprived him of the instructions of the curate, and insisted that he should labour out of doors instead. Heathcliff bore his degradation well at first, because Cathy taught him what she learnt, and worked or played with him in the fields. They both promised to grow up as rude as savages, the young master being entirely negligent how they behaved. It was one of their chief amusements to run away to the moors in the morning and remain there all day, and the after punishment grew a mere thing to laugh at. One Sunday evening they were banished from the sitting-room for making a noise, and when I went to call them to supper, I could discover them nowhere. Hindley, in a passion, told us to bolt the doors, and swore nobody should let them in that night. The household went to bed, and I opened the window, determined to admit them should they return. In a while I heard steps coming up the road. I ran to prevent them waking Mr. Earnshaw by knocking. Heathcliff was by himself. "Where is Miss Catherine?" I cried hurriedly. "At Thrushcross Grange," he answered, "and I would have been there too, but they had not the manners to ask me to stay. Cathy and I escaped for a walk, and, getting a glimpse of the Grange lights, we thought we could just go to see where the Lintons passed their Sunday evenings, and whether they standed shivered in corners while their father and mother sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing before the fire. We ran from the top of the heights to the park, and crept through a broken hedge, up the path to the drawing-room window. We were able to look in by standing on the basement and clinging to the ledge, and we saw, it was beautiful, A splendid place. Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. But now, guess what they were doing. Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Cathy, lay screaming at the farther end of the room. Edgar stood on the hearth weeping. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel. We laughed outright at the stupid things. We did despise them. They heard us and rushed to the door, crying, "Oh, mamma! Oh, mamma! Oh, papa!" We made frightful noises to terrify them still more, and then we felt we'd better flee. I had Cathy by the hand, when all at once she fell down. "Run, Heathcliff, run," she whispered. "They have just let the bulldog loose, and he holds me. The devil had seized her ankle, Nelly." She did not yell out, no. I did, though, and I got a stone and thrust it between his jaws. A servant came up with a lantern at last, and the dog was pulled off. The man took Cathy up. She was sick from pain. He carried her in, and I followed, grumbling curses and vengeance. "What pray, Robert?" hallooed Linton from the entrance. "Skulker has caught a little girl, sir," he replied. "And there's a wicked-looking lad here," he added, making a clutch at me. They pulled me under the chandelier, and Mrs. Linton raised her hands in horror, and while they examined me, Cathy came round, and Edgar Linton recognised her. "They see us at church, you know. That's Miss Earnshaw," he whispered to his mother. "And look how Skulker has bitten her, how her foot bleeds." "Then who is this?" exclaimed Mr. Linton. "Where did she pick up this companion?" "Oh, I declare he is that strange acquisition my late neighbour made on his journey to Liverpool." "A wicked boy at all events," remarked Mrs. Linton, "and quite unfit for a decent house. Did you notice his language, Linton? I'm shocked that my children should have heard it." I recommenced cursing, so the servant was ordered to take me off. I refused to go without Cathy. He dragged me into the garden, pushed the lantern into my hand, and secured the door again. The curtains were still open, and I resumed my station as spy. Catherine sat on the sofa quietly. She was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. The servant brought a basin of water, washed and dried her foot, and then combed her beautiful hair and wheeled her to the fire. I saw they were full of stupid admiration. "She is so immensely superior to them, to everybody on earth, is she not, Nelly?" The luckless adventure made Earnshaw furious. Mr. Linton paid us a visit himself, and read the young master a lecture on the road he guided his family. Heathcliff received no flogging, but was told that the first word he spoke to Miss Catherine should ensure a dismissal. Mrs. Earnshaw undertook to keep her sister-in-law in due restraint when she returned home, employing art, not force. With force she would have found it impossible. Cathy stayed at Thrushcross Grange 5 weeks until Christmas, by which time her ankle was thoroughly cured and her manners much improved. The mistress visited her often and commenced her plan of reform by trying to raise her self-respect with fine clothes and flattery, so that instead of a wild, hatless little savage jumping into the house, there alighted from a handsome black pony a very dignified person. Hindley exclaimed delightedly, "Why, Cathy, you are quite a beauty. I should scarcely have known you. You look like a lady now." "She must mind and not grow wild again," said his wife. She kissed me gently and then looked around for Heathcliff. Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw watched anxiously their meeting, thinking it would enable them to judge what grounds they had for hoping to succeed in separating the two friends. Heathcliff was hard to discover at first. If he were careless and uncared for before Catherine's absence, he had been 10 times more so since. He might well skulk beside the settle on beholding such a bright, graceful damsel entering the house, instead of a rough-headed counterpart of himself as he expected. "Heathcliff," cried Mr. Hindley, "you may come and wish Miss Catherine welcome like the other servants." Catherine flew to embrace him, and she bestowed 7 or 8 kisses on his cheek within the second, and then burst into a laugh, exclaiming, "Why, how very black and cross you look! And that's because I'm used to Edgar and Isabella Linton. Well, Heathcliff, have you forgotten me?" "Shake hands, Heathcliff," said Mr. Earnshaw. "I shall not," replied the boy. "I shall not stand to be laughed at." And he would have broken from the circle, but Miss Cathy seized him again. "I did not mean to laugh at you," she said. "Why are you sulky? If you wash your face and brush your hair, it will be all right. But you are so dirty." "You needn't have touched me," he answered, snatching away his hand. "I shall be as dirty as I please, and I like to be dirty, and I will be dirty." With that, he dashed out of the room. I made the house and kitchen cheerful, with great fires befitting Christmas Eve. Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw, with Catherine, were wrapping up presents for the little Lintons. They had invited them to spend Christmas Day at Wuthering Heights, and the invitation had been accepted on one condition. Mrs. Linton begged that her darlings might be kept carefully apart from that naughty swearing boy. Under these circumstances I remained solitary. I remembered old Earnshaw's fondness for Heathcliff, and his dread lest he should suffer neglect after death had removed him. That, naturally, led me to consider the poor lad's situation now. I got up to seek him. He was not far. I found him in the stable feeding the animals. "Make haste, Heathcliff," I said. "The kitchen is so comfortable. Let me dress you smart before Miss Cathy comes out, and then you can sit together and have a long chatter till bedtime." He never turned his head towards me. I waited, but getting no answer, left him. He worked till 9 o'clock and then marched dumb into his chamber. Cathy came into the kitchen once to speak to him, but he was gone. In the morning he went early on to the moors, not reappearing till the family were departed for church. He hung about me for a while, and then exclaimed abruptly, "Nelly, make me decent. I'm going to be good." "High time, Heathcliff," I said. "I'll arrange you so that Edgar Linton shall look nothing beside you. You are younger and taller and twice as broad across the shoulders. You could knock him down in a twinkling." Heathcliff's face brightened for a moment, and then he sighed. "But if I knocked him down 20 times, that wouldn't make him less handsome, or me more so. I wish I was dressed and behaved as well, and had a chance of being as rich as he will be." "And cried for mamma at every turn," I added. "A good heart will help you to a bonny face, my lad. Now come to the glass and tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome. I'll tell you, I do." I chattered on, and Heathcliff gradually lost his frown and began to look quite pleasant. Our conversation was interrupted by a rumbling sound, and from the window we saw the Lintons descend from their carriage, and the Earnshaws dismount from their horses. I urged my companion to show his amiable humour, and he willingly obeyed. But ill luck would have it that as he opened the door leading from the kitchen on one side, Hindley opened it on the other. The master, irritated at seeing him clean and cheerful, shoved him back inside with a sudden thrust and said, "Keep the fellow out of the room until dinner is over." "Nay, sir," I could not avoid answering. "He ought to have his share of the dainties as well as we." "He shall have his share of my hand if I catch him downstairs," cried Hindley. "What? You are attempting the coxcomb, are you? Wait till I get hold of those elegant locks. See if I don't pull them a little bit longer." "They are long enough already," observed Master Linton. "I wonder they don't make his head ache. It's like a colt's mane over his eyes." Heathcliff's violent nature was not prepared to endure the appearance of impertinence from one whom he seemed to hate as a rival. He seized a tureen of hot apple sauce and dashed it full against Edgar's face and neck. Mr. Earnshaw snatched Heathcliff up directly and conveyed him to his chamber. I got the dishcloth and rather spitefully scrubbed Edgar's nose and mouth. His sister began weeping to go home. Cathy stood by, confounded, blushing for all. "You should not have spoken to him," cried Catherine. "Now you've spoilt your visit, and he'll be flogged. I hate him to be flogged. I can't eat my dinner. Why did you speak to him, Edgar?" "I didn't," sobbed the youth. "I promised Mamma that I wouldn't say one word to him, and I didn't." "Well, don't cry," replied Catherine contemptuously. "Don't make more mischief. My brother is coming. Be quiet. Hush, Isabella. Has anybody hurt you?" I perceived Catherine, throughout the day, was trying to find an opportunity of paying a visit to Heathcliff, who had been locked up by the master. In the evening we had a dance, and Cathy begged that he might be liberated then, but in vain. And when the Gimmerton band and singers arrived, Catherine went upstairs unnoticed by anyone except me. When she came back, Heathcliff came with her, and she insisted that I should take him into the kitchen. I offered him a quantity of good things, but he was sick and could eat little. He sat lost in silence. On my inquiring the subject of his thoughts, he answered gravely, "I'm trying to settle how I shall pay Hindley back. I don't care how long I wait. I hope he will not die before I do." "For shame, Heathcliff," I said. "It is for God to punish wicked people. We should learn to forgive." "No, God won't have the satisfaction that I shall," he returned. "I only wish I knew the best way. Let me alone and I'll plan it out. And while I'm thinking of that, I don't feel the pain."